Integridade confirmada. Aqui está o roteiro final completo. Nota sobre a estrutura solicitada. A estrutura 7, trailer interno, é um módulo fixo aplicado a toda a estrutura principal, nunca escolhida sozinha conforme a própria skill define. Diagnostiquei o caso, 12 instituições atingidas em sequência rápida, e combinei. Estrutura 2, crime acontecendo agora como base. Lies. Estrutura 6, scoreboard, aplicada às 12 empresas. Ply, módulo 7, trailer interno, com ênfase extra dado o pedido. Escala, saga grande. Ford House 807 palavras. Faixa, Ford House 800, Sank House 600. February 2nd, 2026. 9:47 a.m. A glass conference room on the 14th floor of a logistics software company outside Austin, Texas. Rain streaks the window behind an empty chair at the head of the table, the kind of steady gray morning that makes everyone in the room a little slower to question anything unusual because unusual and Monday morning tired look almost the same from across a conference table. 6 people are already seated, laptops open, a half-empty carafe of coffee sweating condensation onto a coaster nobody's used, waiting for a video call to connect for what they believe is an emergency budget review called 40 minutes earlier by their CEO. Someone checks their phone under the table. Someone else scrolls, half listening, already composing the follow-up email they assume this meeting will generate. The call connects. Their CEO appears on screen, in the same gray sweater he wore to yesterday's all-hands, sitting in what looks exactly like his home office, the same framed diploma visible over his left shoulder that's been visible in a dozen calls before this one. He is not there. He has never heard of this meeting, and in the next 6 minutes, this company will become the first of 12. His name, for the purposes of this file, is Daniel Farrow, Chief Financial Officer, 9 years with the company. The one person in that room whose job, specifically, is to notice when a number doesn't add up. He will spend the next 6 minutes on a video call with a face and a voice indistinguishable from his CEO's, discussing a confidential acquisition that does not exist, and by 10 a.m., he will have authorized a transfer that will not be traced for 11 days, because nobody in that room, least of all Farrow, has any reason yet to suspect that 500 miles away in a rented office space above a defunct print shop, a small crew is running the exact same 6 minutes with the exact same software, against a company that has never heard of this one. Farrow would later tell investigators that nothing about those 6 minutes felt rehearsed or unusual in the moment. The synthetic CEO opened, as the real one often did, with a small complaint about the weather delaying his morning commute, a throwaway line that did more to establish authenticity in 4 seconds than any amount of technical polish could have, simply because it was the kind of thing nobody would think to script if they were faking something important. Before this story ends, you're going to see the exact 3 seconds of video lag that eventually gave this away. The one technical flaw that Live Deepfake video, unlike voice alone, has never fully solved. You're going to see the shared spreadsheet the crew behind this kept, tracking 12 companies by name, call time, and dollar amount, recovered later from a laptop nobody thought to encrypt. You're going to see the one security officer at the 8th company targeted, who noticed something the other 7 had missed. And you're going to see exactly how a scheme built to hit 12 companies in 7 days almost hit a 13th on the 8th day, before anyone managed to stop it, and how close that 13th attempt actually came to succeeding anyway. This isn't a story about one deepfake call. This is a story about an assembly line, and about how fast an assembly line can move once nobody catches the first 6 links in it, and how little it actually costs in equipment or expertise to build one. So how does a small crew, working out of a rented office above a print shop, convincingly impersonate 12 different corporate executives in a single week? They don't build 12 different deepfakes. They build one very good process, refine it under real pressure, and run it 12 times. The crew behind this, investigators would eventually identify 4 people directly involved, operating out of a shared workspace in a mid-sized city that has not yet been made public. Didn't begin with Daniel Farrow's company at all. They began 3 months earlier with a much smaller, low-stakes trial run against a regional insurance brokerage that lost $40,000 in a transfer nobody at the company ever formally reported as anything other than an internal accounting error. That first run wasn't about the money. It was about proving the model could hold up on a live call under real-time follow-up questions, rather than just in a pre-recorded clip. Because a recorded deepfake, however convincing, cannot answer an unscripted question, and every serious corporate fraud eventually runs into one. That trial run, according to messages later recovered from the crew's own devices, was treated internally almost like a product beta test rather than a crime. One member's message to the others afterward read, in its entirety, "Worked better than expected, ready to scale this." Language that reads, out of context, almost indistinguishable from a startup's internal Slack channel discussing a successful pilot program. The crew spent the following 10 weeks not planning additional attacks, but refining the underlying rendering pipeline itself, reducing the visible lag between the live performer's real expressions and the synthetic output from just over half a second to under 200 milliseconds, a technical improvement investigators believe was the single most important factor separating this operation's 6 out of 12 success rate from the far lower success rates typically seen in cruder, earlier deepfake fraud attempts reported elsewhere in the country that same year. Here's the mechanism, and it's worth being precise about it, because deepfake video call undersells both how sophisticated and how procedurally simple this had become by early 2026. Real-time video and voice cloning works by feeding a model a relatively short amount of footage of a target, a few minutes of a public earnings call, a keynote, an internal town hall someone had once uploaded to a company intranet, and using it to generate live a synthetic video feed that maps a real person's expressions and voice onto video of someone else actually performing on camera behind the scenes. A live actor sitting off-screen, whose actual facial movements and vocal cadence the model translates, frame by frame, into the target executive's face and voice in real time. The advantage over a purely voice-based scam is enormous. A moving face, blinking, glancing away to check something, even a believable pause to sip coffee, does more to disarm suspicion in 6 minutes than any recorded voicemail ever could. The crew's own internal division of labor, reconstructed later from recovered messages and financial records, was almost embarrassingly small for the scale of what it produced. One member handled research, pulling public footage, cross-referencing corporate org charts to identify who at each target company actually held wire authority, and drafting the specific, plausible detail meant to open each call. A second member ran the technical rendering setup itself, calibrating the model fresh for each new target's footage in the days before a call, since a poorly calibrated model produces exactly the kind of visible glitching that would eventually help end the scheme. A third acted as the live performer behind each call, the person whose actual face and voice the software transformed in real time, chosen in part, investigators believe, for a general vocal register and speech cadence closer to corporate executive neutral than distinctly identifiable, making the transformation's job easier. The fourth managed logistics, burner devices, the shared tracking spreadsheet, and the laundering of whatever funds successfully landed. 4 people working in rotating shifts across a single rented office produced 12 attempted frauds against companies with combined annual revenues in the billions. The trailer for what's still ahead. You're going to see the specific software the crew used, sold legitimately for the film and gaming industry before being repurposed here. You're going to see the recovered spreadsheet tracking all 12 targets, with a column simply labeled Confidence, rating each company's security posture before the call was even placed. You're going to see the one call that nearly failed live on day 4, and the improvisation that saved it. And you're going to see the exact moment on day 7, when 2 separate security teams, 500 miles apart, realized within an hour of each other that they were describing the same crime. Daniel Farrow's company, the first of 12 on day 1, lost $310,000 in that 6-minute call, structured as an emergency vendor payment tied to a supply chain issue the fake CEO described with enough specific, plausible detail, a real vendor name, pulled from a press release the crew had read the week before, that nobody in the room thought to ask a follow-up question that might have exposed the model's limits. Farrow himself, in a statement given weeks later, once the broader pattern became public, described the specific detail that disarmed him most. The synthetic CEO had made a small joke about the same vendor's slow email responses, an offhand remark that matched almost exactly a complaint the real CEO had made in an entirely different meeting 2 weeks earlier. A detail the crew could only have picked up by watching that earlier meeting's recording, quietly uploaded, like so many internal meetings now are, to a company video platform with looser access controls than anyone had thought to audit. That's the first name on the board, beaten not by a flaw in the technology, but by a room full of people whose only real defense, a trusted face on a screen, had just been rendered obsolete without anyone telling them in advance. The second company, a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor in Ohio, lost $480,000 on day 2, targeted through its chief operating officer rather than its CEO. The crew's spreadsheet, recovered later, shows they had specifically researched which executive at each company held wire authorization power, rather than defaulting to the most visible face at the top. This targeting decision, investigators would later note, reflected a level of corporate structure research well beyond what most casual observers assume this kind of fraud requires. The crew had, in several cases, pulled information from state business filings, professional networking profiles, and even archived job postings that listed specific approval authorities as part of a role's stated responsibilities, treating publicly available corporate transparency as a kind of unintentional target list. That's the second name on the board, right behind the Austin logistics firm that fell first. The third, a mid-sized construction firm in Colorado, lost only $60,000 on day 3, the smallest single hit of the week, because the Deepfake call ran into an unscripted question about a subcontractor's name that the live actor behind the synthetic face couldn't answer convincingly, forcing an abrupt, oddly rushed end to the call that left the targeted controller mildly uneasy even as she authorized a smaller interim transfer rather than the full amount requested. She has since described the specific texture of that unease, not suspicion exactly, more a sense that the conversation had ended a beat too quickly, the way a phone call feels unfinished when someone hangs up mid-thought. A feeling strong enough that she flagged the transfer internally for a follow-up review the next morning, a review that, had the crew's schedule allowed them to strike this company again later in the week rather than moving on entirely, might have caught the Pattern 3 companies earlier than it actually was caught. That's the third name on the board, and the first genuine crack in the crew's own confidence. The fourth company very nearly ended the entire operation 2 days early. A regional bank holding company in Missouri, targeted on day 4 through its chief risk officer, hosted a video call in which the synthetic feed briefly, visibly glitched. A half-second stutter in the mouth movement during a moment of genuine surprise from the live actor behind the model, the kind of unscripted human reaction the software handles far less gracefully than rehearsed lines. The chief risk officer, a man who had spent 11 years in his role specifically training himself to notice small inconsistencies in financial statements, later described the sensation of watching that glitch not as alarm, but as a strange, disorienting flicker of déjà vu. The way a familiar word looks briefly wrong if you stare at it too long. A feeling he attributed in the moment to his own tiredness, rather than to anything happening on the screen in front of him. He paused the call to check something, muted his own microphone for 11 seconds. The same 11-second habit that would recur across several targets, executives instinctively buying time rather than immediately voicing suspicion. And, according to his own later account, decided the glitch was probably just his own internet connection, rather than anything wrong with the person on the other end. He authorized the transfer 12 minutes later. $220,000, the fourth name on the board, saved from being the moment the entire crew was caught only by one executive's understandable, very human instinct to blame his own Wi-Fi before he blamed the face on his screen. So, ask the question that would occupy federal investigators and every one of the 12 companies for months afterward. If a synthetic face glitching in front of a trained risk officer isn't enough to stop a fraud, what actually would be? The 5th through 7th companies, a marketing agency in Georgia, a mid-sized freight brokerage in Illinois, and a regional hospital systems finance office in North Carolina, fell across days 5 and 6 in rapid, almost mechanical succession, the crew moving faster now that 4 successful runs had refined their script into something close to a formula. Open with a real specific detail pulled from public information, introduce urgency tied to a deadline that conveniently falls within the hour, deflect any unscripted question by stepping into another call, and promising to follow up by email that never comes, and close before the target has time to verify anything through a second channel. at the hospital system in North Carolina, the seventh target, and the one whose loss stung hardest given the sector. The finance director who authorized the transfer later described a detail that distinguishes hospital finance offices from most corporate ones: the specific, learned instinct to move quickly on anything framed as urgent, because in a hospital, urgency usually means something clinical, something with a patient attached, a reflex that made the fabricated emergency vendor payment for critical equipment land with a kind of institutional credibility that a purely commercial company might have questioned harder. Combined, those three companies lost just over $610,000. That's the fifth, sixth, and seventh names on the board. Three institutions in under 36 hours, each one falling to a version of the exact same 6-minute script with only minor, target-specific details swapped in. It was the eighth company, a regional insurance underwriter in Tennessee, that finally broke the pattern open. Not through any technical detection of the deepfake itself, but through an old-fashioned habit its chief information security officer had insisted on for years, long before deepfakes were a mainstream concern. A strict policy requiring any wire request above $50,000, regardless of who requested it or how urgently, to be independently confirmed through a second communication channel entirely separate from the one the request arrived on. A phone call to a number pulled from the company directory, never from a number given during the call itself. The CISO, a woman in her late 40s who had implemented that policy years earlier after a much more mundane email phishing incident, long before anyone at her company had ever said the word deepfake out loud, later described sitting in that call feeling nothing dramatic at first, just a faint, accumulating sense that something about the conversation's rhythm was slightly off. The kind of feeling, she compared, in a statement given afterward, to noticing a coworker's perfume is different before you can consciously say why. When the synthetic CEO on the video call grew visibly, audibly impatient at the mention of that policy, a level of irritation the live actor behind the model apparently played a half-beat too aggressively, out of step with the real CEO's normally even temperament. Her suspicion, already primed by that irritation, led her to place the verification call immediately rather than after the video call ended. The real CEO reached on his actual cell phone, had never heard of the meeting. That's the eighth name on the board. The first company that didn't win by luck or an unscripted question. The model happened to fumble, but by a boring, unglamorous verification policy that had been sitting in an employee handbook, unused and mostly ignored for 3 years. The CISO's own report, filed within the hour to a regional financial crimes task force, contained a detail that would prove decisive. A description of the synthetic CEO's face during that moment of scripted irritation, including a specific, almost clinical observation that the mouth's movement had briefly fallen roughly 2 to 3 frames out of sync with the audio. An artifact, forensic analysts would later confirm, of the underlying rendering process struggling to keep pace with an emotional register the model hadn't been as thoroughly trained on as calm, measured speech. That same regional task force, it turned out, had received a nearly identical report filed 4 hours earlier from a completely different jurisdiction. The ninth company, a manufacturing firm in Wisconsin, whose own IT director had noticed the same faint audio-visual desync and, out of an abundance of caution rather than any confirmed suspicion, had flagged the incident to the same shared regional cybercrime reporting portal both companies happened to use. That IT director, notably, had no specific fraud detection background at all. He flagged the call almost apologetically in his own words to a colleague afterward, expecting to be told he was overreacting to what was probably just a bad internet connection on someone's end. He was, in fact, initially told exactly that by a first-line intake analyst at the portal, who logged the report as low priority before a supervisor doing a routine end-of-shift review happened to notice its similarity to the Tennessee report filed the same evening. It was that supervisor's own habit of skimming every report in her queue before signing off, regardless of assigned priority level, that produced the actual connection. A single person's diligence standing between this pattern being caught on day 7 and continuing, undetected, for however many more weeks the crew might have run it. It was that shared portal, built for exactly this kind of cross-jurisdictional pattern matching, and used up to that point mostly for far more mundane phishing complaints, that connected the two reports within an hour of each other on the evening of day 7, and from there, within another 6 hours, connected them to the previous 7 incidents once investigators began actively searching for similar reports rather than waiting for them to arrive. The 10th, 11th, and 12th companies, a regional airlines cargo division, a specialty chemical manufacturer, and a mid-sized telecommunications provider, all targeted within the final 36 hours of the crew's planned 7-day run, had each independently already begun tightening internal verification procedures following informal warnings that had started circulating through regional business associations once whispers of the pattern reached local news outlets. The chemical manufacturer's chief financial officer, alerted specifically by a colleague at another company who had heard about the Tennessee incident secondhand over drinks the previous evening, refused the call entirely, hanging up mid-sentence to independently verify through his own company's real emergency contact protocol. A decision he later admitted, with some embarrassment, he might not have made a week earlier, before the warning reached him purely by social coincidence rather than any formal industry alert. The telecommunications provider's controller did the same, 20 minutes later, having received the same informal warning through an entirely different regional network, a local chapter of a corporate finance professionals association whose group chat had, by that point, turned almost entirely toward comparing notes on the pattern. The airline's cargo division alone, the 12th and final target, had not yet heard any warning at all when the call came in. But its chief operating officer, a naturally cautious man by every account from colleagues, simply found the urgency of the request suspicious enough on its own to ask for a follow-up email before authorizing anything, a request the crew, apparently already aware their window was closing, never fulfilled. That COO asked afterward why he'd hesitated with no specific knowledge of the pattern at all, said only that something about being asked to move that much money that quickly, on a video call, without any paperwork trail forming behind it, simply didn't sit right. The same vague pre-verbal unease that had made several other executives that week pause for 11 seconds before authorizing a transfer anyway. Both institutions were saved not by any technical detection at all, but by word of mouth outrunning the crew's own remaining schedule, and by one man's willingness to trust an unglamorous, unprovable gut feeling over a familiar, urgent face on a screen. Federal agents working from the combined case file the regional task force had assembled identified and arrested all 4 members of the crew within 5 weeks of the 8th company's report, faster than many comparable financial crime investigations, aided significantly by the crew's own habit of keeping detailed, uncoded records of exactly what they'd done, apparently confident that the operation would be over, and the funds laundered long before any single company's individual investigation could ever connect it to the others. None of the 4 had any prior arrest record for financial crime. 2 had worked previously, entirely legitimately, in freelance video editing and visual effects work that had dried up, according to court filings, in the same wave of industry contraction that has left many people with exactly this specialized skill set searching for other uses for it. In a labor market that has shown far more interest in what the technology can automate away than in retraining the people whose craft it was built on top of. That's the same uncomfortable thread running through several of the cases on this channel. Genuinely skilled, technically capable people, displaced from legitimate versions of the exact same work, finding a criminal application for a skill set the legal market had simply stopped paying for at the same volume, in an industry that shed jobs faster than it retrained the people who'd held them. None of this abstraction erases what the 6 successful attacks actually cost. A payroll administrator at the Ohio pharmaceutical distributor, call her Denise Okoro for this file, a single mother of 2 who had been with the company for 11 years, was the one who processed the $480,000 transfer at her COO's direct instruction, following a chain of command she had followed without incident for over a decade. She remembers the specific, mundane texture of that Tuesday morning, a school drop-off that ran 4 minutes late, a coffee she never finished, the transfer request arriving in her queue exactly the way dozens of legitimate ones had before it, flagged as urgent by a face and a voice she had no reason on earth to doubt, because she had been on video calls with that same COO every week for years. She processed it in under 10 minutes. The same efficient competence that had made her, by every account from coworkers, one of the most reliable people in the department. In the weeks after the fraud was discovered, before investigators had confirmed the full scope of the 12-company pattern, an internal review at her own company briefly treated her, alongside the COO whose face had appeared on the call as a potential person of interest. Not formally accused of anything, but quietly excluded from several finance department meetings and asked twice to walk investigators through her exact actions that morning, in detail that felt, to her, uncomfortably close to an interrogation. She described in that same statement sitting in her car in the company parking lot after the second interview, calling her sister rather than going back inside, because she needed, just for a few minutes, to hear someone say out loud that she hadn't actually done anything wrong. She was formally cleared within 3 weeks once the broader 12-company pattern became clear enough to make her own innocence self-evident. A pattern that notably existed already at the time of her first interview, sitting unshared in a regional task force's case file that her own company's internal investigators simply hadn't yet been given access to. She has described in a brief statement given to a local business journal the specific unease of realizing that doing her job exactly the way she'd always done it had somehow briefly made her look like part of the crime. And that's really the uncomfortable center of this whole case. The 4 people behind the scheme built something that worked in 6 out of 12 attempts, entirely because it exploited a form of trust, a familiar face, live and responsive on a screen, that every single one of these companies had built years of internal process around treating as reliable, without ever imagining it could be manufactured convincingly enough to survive a live, unscripted conversation. The technology that made this possible is not on its own illegal, dangerous, or even unusual. The same real-time face and voice mapping tools are used daily in film production, video game development, and accessibility software for people who have lost the ability to speak in their own voice. What separates a legitimate use from what happened to these 12 companies is not the tool. It is 6 minutes of intent run 12 times in a single week against people who had no reasonable way in the moment to know the difference. The crew's own recovered spreadsheet, the one investigators eventually built most of their case around, contained one additional column that has stayed with several people involved in the case long after the arrests. A running total, updated after each call, labeled simply week total, climbing steadily from $310,000 to just over $1.68 million by the time of the 8th company's failed attempt. A number the crew was tracking with the same flat procedural attention most companies reserve for a sales dashboard. No different in tone from the 12 companies' own internal spreadsheets tracking legitimate quarterly revenue on the very same afternoons. In the months since the arrests, several of the 12 companies have quietly adopted the same verification policy that stopped the 8th attack, and at least 2 industry associations have begun circulating guidance recommending it as a baseline standard rather than an optional precaution, language that several of the smaller companies involved have said they wish had existed in any form before rather than after their own names ended up on a stranger's spreadsheet. None of that guidance carries the force of regulation. It exists for now purely as word of mouth among finance departments that have started comparing notes the way this crew's targets eventually did. Informally after the fact, exactly one company behind the pace the crew was moving at. This case made it to the channel. Not everyone does. Some files never leave the vault. The ones still under active investigation. The ones where a name can't be printed yet without compromising a federal case spanning multiple states. If you want those, the link's in the description. So, who actually failed here? 12 companies that each, individually, trusted the same familiar face too quickly, or an industry that spent years building verification policies for stolen passwords and forged signatures while never quite getting around to asking what happens the day someone can fake the face itself. Leave your answer below. Half of you are already about to disagree with the other half, and it's worth noting that the 4 remaining companies who escaped this crew's list did so almost entirely by luck and timing rather than any policy the other 8 lacked. Because the technology that beat 6 companies in a single week is only getting faster, cheaper, and harder to spot with every model released since. And the 8-company failure rate that finally caught this crew depended entirely on one insurance company's 3-year-old, mostly ignored verification policy actually being followed on exactly the right afternoon by exactly the person paying close enough attention to notice a half-beat of misplaced irritation on a face that, to everyone else in the room, looked completely, convincingly real. And if you want to see the case where the call wasn't fake at all, but the person making it had been coached, line by someone standing just out of frame, that story is waiting right here.